So, as you can see, the very elegant lady to my right is obviously not Martin Gundinger, who is currently at the Austrian Parliament as an expert on the current budget hearing, but Dr. Birgit Niesner is our new head economist, chief economist of the Austrian Central Bank. She started her job on November 1st, and we're very proud to have a practitioner, because she was in banking for her entire career, but she's also an academic and researcher and has published a lot of papers and has been working on finance and on our industry for a very, very long time. She's a graduate of LSE, as we just discussed before, but we are proud to have her, and I will briefly take over because Dr. Niesner is jumping in on the last minute for Martin, and she has another appointment at 12, and we just exchange. But without further ado, the floor is yours. Please do your job. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind words. Welcome to the next panel. The title is Green Markets, How Capitalism Can Protect the Environment. And my task is now to introduce shortly the distinguished speakers on my right-hand side. They will talk briefly, as I've just heard, so you will have the occasion to ask questions. On my right side, you can see Mr. Chris Barnard, who is, if I have understood correctly, more European than American, so he spent his life in Europe, and he is the founder of the British chapter of the Conservation Alliance. He holds a degree in international relations from the LSE, and I'm sure that he will talk about the book which is lying in front of him, so I'm not going to mention this. The lady on my further right is Danielle Butcher. She is the Executive Vice President of the American Conservation Coalition, but she is also, and this is the link to Chris, she is also in the advisory board of the British chapter, and she holds a degree in political science and rhetoric communications from Bethel University in Minnesota. I'm sure that content-wise, she will be more explicit of which topics move her and what she's going to present to you. And finally, I would like to introduce Mr. Rod Richardson. He is the president of the Grace Richardson Fund, which is a private foundation that pioneers new free market solutions for critical issues in gridlock. You also see from the program that he is the co-founder of the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council. I'm sure that we will learn more. And he, and this is now again the link back to the first speaker, is a co-author. He contributed to the book, which is going to be introduced by Chris. Thank you very much for being with us. I hope we will have enjoyable next 45 minutes. And Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate being here. And we were actually supposed to, this is my first time in Vienna, and we were actually supposed to be here about this time last year for the launch of this book, but obviously COVID put a dent in those plans, so it's good to be here with you today to present a little bit about the book and talk about an issue that matters very much to myself and my fellow co-panelists. The environment is something that has obviously garnered a lot of attention in international circles, especially the issue of climate change. And for a long time, I'm 23, Danielle's 2 years older, she's 25. And as young people that believe in the free market, that believe in the power of entrepreneurship and freedom, we've been disappointed by the lack of engagement from the free market side on this issue of the environment and climate change more specifically. Because we are kind of the leaders of the next generation, and we realize how much this issue matters to people our age, but we're worried that the only solutions being presented to them are solutions like the Green New Deal. And that is very worrisome to us because we care about the environment, we think that we need to protect our planet, we think that this is an issue that deserves being addressed, but we also believe that the solutions that are being presented to us, the solutions that we are supposed to be holding up, are solutions rooted in the government or rooted in central planning, rooted in ideas like the Green New Deal, and those are ideas that we categorically reject. but at the same time, we want to tackle this issue. So where are we left? And I'll let Danielle talk a little bit more about the birth of the organization that I now work for in Washington, D.C., the American Conservation Coalition. And she can talk a little bit more about the history of that movement and how it grew. But I'm interested, as a policy director, in the ideas that can push this narrative forward. And so, while I was in the UK, before I moved to the US, I was studying at the London School of Economics, and I found out about this organization called the American Conservation Coalition. And I thought, well, finally, here's an organization that represents both my views as an environmentalist, someone passionate about nature and the world that we live in, as well as someone who believes in the free market and the power of entrepreneurship. And so I decided to found the British chapter, like you mentioned, called the British Conservation Alliance, which does very similar work in the UK, empowering young people to promote free market and market-based ideas to environmental issues. But as much as we want to be activists on this issue, as much as we want to change this narrative, we can't do that without the ideas to underpin that. And that's my problem with a lot of people, especially young activists on the left, is they're activists for the sake of being activists. They don't have very many original ideas. They don't have very many ways of looking at this that will actually solve a problem as complex as climate change. And so with the help of Danielle and Rod, my co-panelists, we decided to write a book, a manifesto for this more market-based approach to environmentalism. And so the result, which I guess I'm now finally presenting in Vienna, is it's called Green Market Revolution, How Market Environmentalism Can Protect Nature and Save the Planet. And my co-editor for this book was actually Kai Weiss, who works for the Austrian Economics Center. So that's the link to Vienna here. And the really cool thing about this book is that this wasn't just Kai and myself sitting down and just writing down thoughts. We gathered some of the brightest and best minds around the world that have already been working on this issue to put together a tome that really is the most up-to-date, most in-depth declaration and manifesto on what a market-based approach to the environment looks like. And so we had 21 authors from 15 organizations in 5 countries around the world. We had Lord Daniel Hannan from the UK write the foreword. We had the book was endorsed by Lord Matt Ridley, by Steve Forbes, by Leszek Balcerowicz, and we had some of the top minds in the free market world really kind of rallying around these ideas of how can we tackle these environmental issues that are top of mind. And so before I quickly pass on to my fellow co-panelists, I wanted to quickly run through the 4 main principles of this concept that we call market environmentalism. And the first one is obviously the market economy, the idea that the best way to solve our environmental problems is through the dynamism of the market, the power of innovation and entrepreneurship. And if you actually look at richer countries, that the freer a market in a country, the better its environmental outcomes. And the statistics on this are very clear. So that's kind of the first principle, the market economy. The second principle is another very free market principle, is private property rights. Aristotle said that which no one owns, no one takes care of. And that's something that we see bear out throughout history. Again, in terms of statistics, the countries with the highest level of private property rights tend to have the best environmental outcomes as well, because there is a direct incentive to take care of the land that we own, and that we are a part of, rather than this idea of the tragedy of the commons. The third principle is the idea of decentralization or localism, the idea that local communities tend to be better at taking care of the local environment than a central, faraway bureaucracy in the capital city. I'm sure you've all heard of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom. She did pioneering work on this and showed that in the absence of government intervention, local communities actually do a very good job of coming together and coming up with solutions that work at the local level, with kind of this Hayekian theory of knowledge that what you know at the local level is much more efficient than anything a faraway centralized bureaucracy could come up with. And then the fourth and final central principle of market environmentalism, which is probably my favorite, because it is what I feel differentiates us from the ideas on the left, is this idea of belief in the innovation, in the belief in innovation and optimism. And a lot of the narrative when it comes to the left, when we look at this problem of the environment and climate change is very apocalyptic. It's very doom and gloom. It's about how capitalism is destroying the planet, how humans are so terrible. And our approach is, no, actually, humans are the ultimate resource. Humans are the ones that can come up with innovative solutions to these problems. We're the ones that can really use the power of optimism to tackle this issue. And psychological research actually backs this up. Steven Pinker from the University of Harvard shows in his book that psychological research actually tells us that if you tell someone that the issue of climate change is so bad and that it's apocalyptic and that billions of people are going to die, they're actually less likely to A, accept the reality, and B, want to do something about it. But if you tell them that real solutions exist, that if we rally together and come up with innovations and optimistic solutions to tackle this, they're more likely to A, believe in it, and B, want to do something about it. So I think that's the message I want to leave with you today, is that we have an optimistic message of innovation and entrepreneurship to tackle environmental issues, including climate change. And I think it's very exciting that there's a whole new generation of thinkers that are pushing this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And thank you, Chris, for laying out the groundwork of what these principles can look like. I'd like to provide a little bit of context to what Chris has been talking about. And the context is the why. Why market environmentalism? Why advocate for these reforms? And so I think the best place to start is with the founding of my organization, the American Conservation Coalition. It was founded in 2017 by a group of young American activists who leaned right of center, believed in markets, believed in innovation, and the power of entrepreneurship, who really cared about the environment but did not see solutions that we could get behind being championed by the right or the left. The left of center tends to be very socialist or central planning in their nature with these solutions, very government heavy, and the right of center wasn't talking about these issues at all. And so we would speak to our peers. Young people in particular really care about the environment. It's consistently a top 3 issue for them. And we would hear from them that they were voting Democrat or progressive because of the environment, because of climate change, and they weren't hearing solutions from the other side of the aisle. And so we wanted to solve that issue and provide a better way forward. Young Americans and young people around the world deserve better solutions that will work for them economically and environmentally. So as much as the environment can be an economic challenge, it is also a cultural challenge. And I think the work that my organization does tends to lean in toward that cultural side. The fact of the matter is we know that through the principles Chris laid out, market solutions do work for the environment. They do lead to clean economies. But they work so well that we're fighting a battle against a battle of messaging, if you will. So we have this term that has been coined recently, you may have heard of it, of greenwashing. And greenwashing, in my opinion, is the idea that progressives have presented to explain away why or how markets work so well when it comes to being green. So you have capitalism through its market system is providing, sustainability, and companies are embracing sustainability because their consumers are demanding that, because they see young people want it, consumers want it. And so what we see on the left is progressives are saying it's greenwashing, and they're ascribing intent and purity tests to why the market is working, rather than just showing that incentives can provide positive economic solutions and environmental solutions. So we see companies responding to demand, consumers holding that power and voting with their money. And I think that this idea of greenwashing is really the biggest evidence we have that markets do work. They work so well that we have to explain it away. So ACC was founded to champion right-of-center solutions and market solutions, and to help fight that cultural battle and show people that markets do work, because we aren't hearing that anywhere else.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you very much, Barbara, for hosting this wonderful conference and giving us an opportunity to put forward some new ideas. I think that, for many, many years, I've listened to panels at free market-oriented conferences, and, it's always struck me that the argument around climate change that is presented is half right. And the half that's right is that the solutions that are being presented by the mainstream climate policy community are a disaster for freedom. They're terrible, and they're not going to solve climate change either. And that's the part that's half right. The part that is missing, and the reason why we're here today, is that the freedom movement is missing the single biggest opportunity to expand freedom around the world. Climate change is going to be answered by expanding competition and by expanding markets. And we have some pretty good ideas about how you can do that globally to introduce economic freedom into markets that do not have it now. And that's what's going to change those economies and make them cleaner, actually, over time, quickly. So let me back up and give you a little bit about my background. My name's Rod Richardson. I'm the president of the Grace Richardson Fund. The Richardson Foundations, and there are several of them, have been involved in conservative and free market policy for a long, long time. My father, Randy Richardson, was the head of the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and they pioneered many of the ideas that became the Reagan Revolution. And the way that they did this was to address the issues of the day, whatever they were, whatever those concerns were, with a better free market solution. So it doesn't really matter what those issues are. If you're coming at it with a free market solution, you will be expanding freedom. Now, I think climate change is real, but in fact, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not from this perspective. Because if this is a big concern that's out there and you're coming at it with a really good free market solution that expands freedom and expands economic opportunities, that's a good thing. So it doesn't really matter. You know, you can get over that hump of whether climate change is real or not, because you can expand economic freedom if you address it properly. You know, it had struck me when I set out to figure out what we should address at the Grace Richardson Fund, that climate change was not really being adequately addressed by the free market community. They had done a very good analysis of why things, you know, the classic policies were long, why taxing people more and regulating people more is a terrible idea. But they hadn't really come up with a solution. Well, what are we actually going to do that's going to, you know, really move the ball forward, other than, you know, drill for more natural gas, which is great, but, you know, that's not a comprehensive answer. You know, our hypothesis, which we went public with in 2016, is this: that you've seen in the last 10 years a revolution in clean technologies. You've seen clean technologies go from being fundamentally unprofitable to being profitable and competitive in markets where it makes sense. So, and in fact, lower costs than fossil fuels in some markets. When that happens, what that means is that all of the policies that you had to do to support something that were basically unprofitable, all the backflips that you had to do, now no longer make sense. The carbon pricing, the regulation, et cetera. That's not what matters. When you have something that's profitable and competitive, the most important thing you need to do is let it compete. Okay, that is what you need to do. That's the first priority. And in fact, we see all over the world markets where you cannot get a clean technology into those markets because they are so crony dominated that they're, you know, they may be running on fossil fuels, but they cannot even keep the lights on because everybody's stealing everything out of the system and it's monopoly run. And, you know, I went to a conference yesterday. Mainstream Renewable Power was the company. Very impressive company. They've built out 25% of the UK's wind capacity, and they have projects from South Africa to Vietnam to you know, Nigeria and Chile, and they're doing these wonderful you know, projects all over the world. But they told me there are many, many, many more countries that they cannot get into. The markets are closed, right? So in the desire to address climate change, one of the most important things that is going to have to be done is to open up those markets. And how do you do it? One of the things that we pointed out is that not only is the necessity for competition going to be key, but there are new policy opportunities as well. Because once you have profitable companies, there's a new policy lever you can pull. which is the tax rates on those profits, right? You can use basically Ronald Reagan-style supply-side tax cuts, marginal rate cuts, to accelerate clean technologies, right? You do not have to use wealth transfer subsidies where you're, robbing Peter to pay Paul. In fact, that doesn't work. That constricts the market. The U.S. Tax credit system is ridiculous. Only the Berkshire Hathaways of the world can play in that market. If you're an entrepreneur trying to do $5–10 million size projects, good luck trying to get a tax credit off-taker for that. They're only interested in these $50 million projects. So it constricts the market to very large players. Tax rate cuts are something different. Now, we started, what we did in 2016 and what we're still doing today and what we're asking you to do is to ask, we were saying, look, this is a fundamentally new policy opportunity. Nobody's really thought through what the free market approach to climate change was before, we started doing it. Nobody's really considered how do you, if it's necessary to accelerate low-carbon technologies at speed and scale, how do you do it by free market means, right? And the answers to that are not, we can kind of see the outlines, but the specifics of that is something that think tanks like, operated by people like yourselves in the room have to figure out and work together and cooperate across borders, because this is really an international problem. So there has to be that kind of group cooperation, and that's what we did at Grace Richardson Fund. We pulled together groups of think tanks to start thinking about the idea of clean tax cuts and clean free trade, clean competition, and how these things work together. And let me give you a flavor of some of these ideas. Clean tax cuts is the idea of these marginal rate tax cuts. If you use them in concert with clean free trade, which is free trade for environmentally beneficial goods and services, and you use that in concert with the idea of clean competition, that you need to open up markets to competition, which is very important, by the way. If you use these things together, you can have a very powerful policy for climate change. That's very free market. And let me just mention that competition in markets is really important. There's an excellent paper by Wayne Weingarten at the Pacific Research Institute. PRI was one of the think tanks started by Sir Anthony Fisher, the same guy that started Atlas. Wayne's paper on competition shows that competitive power markets in the United States are decarbonizing almost twice as fast as the uncompetitive markets, and they're doing so at a lower cost than the energy. The clean energy is cheaper. They're doing it faster and cheaper than the uncompetitive markets, and the reason is quite simple: that competitive markets are much more responsive. They respond to their customers. They respond to incentives. They respond, quickly. The monopoly markets simply don't respond. The incentives are all wrong. They will want to keep using the most expensive technology they can because they can just rate base it, and the higher the cost, the higher their profits, which is, absurd. So one of the, there are a couple of ways to do these clean tax cuts. We had different groups that thought these through. For instance, R Street Institute R Street, which is a think tank in Washington, thought through how to apply these to the automobile sector. One idea is to, a good place to do it because we know all the metrics of sustainability there. So you can reduce sustainability in an automobile company to one number, the average vehicle fleet emissions, right? You can take that one number and turn it into a tax rate. The lower the emissions, the fleet emissions, the lower the tax rate. You give an incentive from everyone from the boardroom to the shoproom floor, because they all own stock, the employees too, the management, to drive the company cleaner. That's one possible way to do it. But one of the best ways to do it is an idea that was developed at Columbia University called clean asset bonds and loans. Clean asset bonds and loans are private tax-exempt bonds and loans for clean infrastructure development. These are not for governments, these are for private developers. And what these do is they lower the cost of capital. You can lower the cost of debt by up to 20 to 30%, depending on tax rates in the country you're in. That drives down the cost of clean energy, clean cars. It leverages up return on equity, so it makes both the debt and the equity attractive. It's incredibly cost effective. In the United States, for instance, the reason it's so cost effective is that you're giving the tax expense comes on the debt side where the returns are low. U.S. Average return on debt for the last 10 years is about 4%. Return on equity has been around 13.6. So for these energy projects and infrastructure projects, which often raise debt and equity at the same time, you are having 350% more tax revenue on the equity side and a 50-50 capital stack than you're giving up in tax expense on the debt side. Now, one of the things that you could do with these kinds of instruments is use them not just as an incentive for clean energy, but use them as an incentive for competition and free markets. You use them as an incentive in a trade deal, in an international trade deal, to open up markets to competition. You say, look, we'll do a agreement on tax reciprocity on clean asset bonds and loans, which will open up international capital flows, tax advantage capital flows, where a market is, you know, because we need to accelerate this, this will be a low tax environment. And all you need to do is open up your markets to competition to join in. So we can actually offer a carrot for people to join in a free trade agreement and open up these markets, which will tend to address lots of problems such as underdevelopment, poverty, you know, black markets, human trafficking, et cetera, all these things which are driven by the fact that you cannot have any development at all in some of these countries where you know, the power market is crony dominated because there simply isn't any power to plug your development into. So in any event, that is a brief outline of, you know, how some of these ideas can help us. Chris is going to help me in Glasgow on Monday at the Climate and Freedom Symposium. There's a little card that's out on the table outside, and it has a live stream link if you want to hear a deeper dive into some of these ideas on Monday.
Thank you very much, especially the idea of the carrot. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to hand back to Dr. Kolm, who will take the first question from the audience, I hope for some icebreaker. Thank you for being with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Niesner, and thanks for joining. Thanks for all your comments and for also pushing, especially into the direction of clean asset bonds and loans, because this is, of course, also of interest for us here in Austria, but there is an issue in Europe. There are no equity markets, or very little equity markets in contrast to the US. But without further ado, I would simply open the floor, because I think you have provoked, all the three of you have provoked enough now to raise questions. I take the first one. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Anca Lungu from Friedrich von Hayek Institute, Romania. For Mr. Richardson, one question. You talk about freedom and competitive market. What you can tell me about China and green market? Thank you.
Well, you know, I'm not sure that China is exactly a free market. You know, and it seems to me that they're having a moment right now where they're clamping down on the entrepreneurs. They want them to toe the political line. They're tired of people like Jack Ma criticizing the government, and so they're clamping down. Long term, if I can get a little bit philosophical though, long term I'm optimistic about China. And that is because I believe capitalism is in their blood. You know, I think that it goes back a long time. And indeed, let me tell you a curious fact. The oldest free market idea preceding even Adam Smith was laissez-faire, which was, laissez-faire was a concept promulgated by the French physiocrats in the 16th and 17th century, and then early 18th century. And the person who popularized this the most was François Quesnay, who was a travel writer. And laissez-faire is actually a translation from his travel writings of the Chinese Taoist Confucian concept of Wu Wei. Wu Wei is actionless action. And in the Ming and Han dynasties, it became a Confucian concept of, you know, that the rulers should let the people do what they needed to do. The rulers should rule with a very light touch and let the market essentially blossom without too much of a heavy-handed interference. So Wu Wei was this concept which actually translated into French became laissez-faire, which became Adam Smith's invisible hand. Benjamin Franklin, by the way, introduced Adam Smith to the philosophes at the point when Adam Smith was merely a moral philosopher. He was traveling in France and met Benjamin Franklin, and that's how we got there. But so it's interesting that the basic idea for capitalism is in fact a Chinese idea, and I think that, you know, the Chinese have that in their blood. It's been in, you know, that concept is alive today. In China, they have a concept called Wu Wei Darji, which is, you know, a management technique of letting your employees do what they're going to do what they need to do, trusting them to be good, you know, to have the independence to manage the company right. So that idea is still there, and I think that that is going to be the saving grace for China.
Thank you, Rod. Other questions? Yes.
Can I just very briefly want to offer an additional thought on that, kind of bring it from the philosophical to the empirical. China is obviously the world's largest emitter. They still have huge amounts of coal production, et cetera. But they're also actually leading the world in solar panel production, in wind turbine production. They're slowly moving into the nuclear energy space, electric vehicle space. And that's because they realize that this is really kind of the energy of the future. The reason that Saudi Arabia has played such a strong role in geopolitics is because they dominated the oil industry, which was kind of the energy of the last decades. And in the future, that it will no longer be oil, it won't be coal, it won't even be natural gas in a few decades, it'll be clean energy. And China realizes that if they want to compete with the rest of the world, they have to do that on clean energy. And so one of the things that we advocate at the American Conservation Coalition is for countries like the US to lead on these kind of free market competitive ideas for clean energy, to be able to kind of start this clean energy arms race that will hopefully get countries around the world to compete with each other to get to clean energy as fast as possible and help tackle an issue like climate change around the world, not just in the West.
Thank you, Chris. Next question in the back there.
Hi, thank you very much. It seems to me that one of the problems that we have is, like, as market-oriented people, we understand, you know, if the forest's private, then you want to farm it forever. Whereas if you just, like, borrow it from the government, then you can clear-cut it, and the taxpayer is essentially going to need to restore the forest. But how do you sell? I mean, when you speak to the general public, you say, well, if we privatize the river, then, you know, people aren't going to be able to pollute it because the owner of the river will sue them. But people's view is, privatize the river? Like, you can't own nature. Like, oh, no. If you allow people to own nature, then the greedy capitalists will, you know, just exploit it for everything it's worth. How do you get over the psychological element to this, where people have a sense of disapprobation or disgust when it comes to the idea of owning nature or having property rights over nature?
Who are you addressing the question to?
Christopher and Danielle primarily, but.
Well, I think that when you're faced with this, you need to challenge the premise, which is that government is capable of taking good care of our wild spaces. In the US, our national parks are something that Americans love to visit and love to spend time at, and yet they have a backlog of billions of dollars in maintenance. So the trails are falling apart, and different structures are falling apart, and they're really not as well maintained as they should be. And so this idea that government is capable of maintaining it and that it's their duty to maintain it when they're failing is the first thing that I would point out, and is to just show that our private parks are very well maintained, very gorgeous, and our national parks are not being taken care of. So I would challenge the premise if you were faced with something like that.
Chris and then Rod, yeah.
Yeah, I'll quickly say that our instinct as people that believe in the free market is to respond with facts and logic and say like, no, actually this and this and this. And I think one of the things that we've realized, especially with young people on an issue that is as emotional as the environment, is that you have to lead with stories and a narrative rather than with just the facts and the evidence. And so what Danielle mentioned about kind of people's experience in national parks versus private parks is a very good example. I think another very good example is the fact that actually most of the impressive conservation projects in the United States, for example, the country where we live, are led by private individuals. And I'm sure that's what Rod's going to talk a little bit about as well. But if you look at some of the areas where, for example, the wild bison has been brought back, or there's been conservation projects to bring back animals that were on the brink of extinction and bringing them back to being actually flourishing species, they've happened under private leadership and in privately owned lands. And that's a pretty incredible narrative to show that in places where the government allowed them to be killed off and allowed kind of this tragedy of the commons, private individuals and entrepreneurs are actually bringing them back. And I think pointing towards those stories is a way of showing that private individuals can actually do very good things for nature.
Rod, please add on, and then I have a question from the gentleman in the back.
2 points in response to that. I believe that, while private property rights are important, it's also important to, at the same time, emphasize the importance of public rights to access to nature. I think that in the UK, the idea of the right to roam is an extremely good one and is very consistent with, very long legal traditions that we've had even in the United States of what's called the public trust doctrine. The idea that everyone has the right to, for instance, access to the foreshore. They have the right to navigate the waters. And in the UK, that's being extended to you have the right to, walk through forests and parks on traditional paths. I think that if I think that it would be a good idea to combine those ideas and say we're going to give people private ownership of land, but there will be a right to roam. Not to camp on the land, but to walk through undefined trails and things like that. And I think that will ease some of that concern. The other thing is that, you just have to, I think you have to point out that the phenomenal success in, for instance, the United States on private land conservation, when you have private land conservation, you can, first of all, there is already an incentive to conserve it, but you can increase that incentive with, some interesting incentives. Like, for instance, we have the charitable, we have a conservation easement tax deduction, which is basically it's like giving to charity. You get a tax deduction for it. That was first introduced under Ronald Reagan in California as a governor, and then signed into law nationally under Ford, and then expanded again under Reagan in the 80s. And since the 80s, about 33 million acres of forests have been regrown in the United States. Something like 60 million acres have gone into private conservation. So the success of, you think about that in contrast to the rainforests of the world, most of which are not, subject to private ownership rights or even the rule of law for that matter, and the devastating consequences. I mean, one solution to deforestation would be private property rights and something like a conservation easement tax deduction. You know, think how many acres of rainforest we could regrow if that's what we did.
Thank you. There's the next question over there, and then the next one here.
Okay, thanks a lot for your presentations. I have a comment and a question. One comment is that Austrian economics is not always about markets. It's about voluntary cooperation. And in Austria, maintenance of paths in national parks is often organized by clubs. It's the Alpenverein or Naturfreunde, which is simply people who are voluntary together and say, okay, we like mountaineering, and one of our tasks is maintaining the paths on the mountains. And so this is also a way how this can be organized. So maintaining the nature and organize this does not always have to be through markets. It can be also other forms of cooperation. And my question is that I sometimes have the feeling that libertarians or liberals very failed on this issue on climate change, because as soon as it became obvious that emissions of CO2 also might hurt other people, so in some sense it's a violation of their property rights, we have to do something about it. And the question is, how do we organize? So we use the atmosphere as CO2 deposit. We can do so in many countries still for free. So how do we organize the allocation of this scarce resource? Because it's too easy to say, okay, market will do that. No, to make markets work, we need property right. We need to have rules how to organize this resource. And I'm asking how shall we organize it? Which rules should we implement to have incentives for markets to work properly?
Thank you. Who wants to go first of you? Rod?
Yeah, I think that, you know, in general, economists looking at that issue have said that it's really not practical to assign property rights to the air. You know, I mean, it's just too ephemeral. It's floating all over the place. You can do that to land because it stays in one place, but air, you know. So I don't think that you can approach it that way. I think that, you know, my best answer is to, as I said, pursue a policy of removing the barriers to the clean solutions, right? To remove the tax, the trade, the anti-competitive, and the regulatory barriers. But it also means, with clubs like yours, you know, that you mentioned, you know, in the U.S., I do think we have a good system of charitable tax deductions, which makes it much easier for private groups to do good works. You don't have to rely always on the government. You know, if people are putting their money, you know, towards, you know, a private effort, I would say that's more valuable than paying their money in taxes. So let's give them a charitable tax deduction to do it. I think that in Europe, the fact that you do not have charitable tax deductions has tilted your society into over-reliance on the government for everything. And I think that that's a tragedy which you need to reverse.
Chris?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add on your comment about Austrian economics not necessarily being just about markets. I think that's entirely correct, and that's why one of the principles that we talked about here is this idea of decentralization, and that local communities are, in fact, incredibly good at coming together to take care of something that they care about. And for example, in the United Kingdom, you have the National Trust, which is kind of one of the most incredible organizations, which has zero government funding, is entirely kind of driven by private individuals, which has conserved not only buildings and parks and things like that, but also areas of wildlife and conservation and things like that. So I do think it's important for libertarians and free marketeers to not only talk about climate change and emissions and things like that, but also about kind of the tangible things that matter to people, and how voluntary cooperation in local communities can actually be very successful in helping that.
Rod wants to add something.
Well, I just wanted to say, is there anyone here who would like to help us develop these clean free market ideas for Europe?
Well, there is one gentleman having, Sitting in the very back, Wolfgang Müller, who has been working on this for more than a decade, I would say almost 2 decades already. And I know he will be part of our club. And when we close up, I will definitely announce who of us is capable of doing that and will help.
Oh, great.
So, but you started the promotion already. Next question here. But
thank you all for bringing these ideas here and presenting your work. One question to Mr. Richardson. As an investor, how do I help the green revolution along? How do I?
Well, there are a ton of different ways to do that. You know, depending on how active you want to get or how entrepreneurial. You know, if you just want to invest some of your money, I would, you know, introduce you to, you know, some of my friends that say Trillium Asset Management. Or, you know, if you have a lot of money to throw at something, my friend Jigger Shaw's company, Generate Capital, you know, does, you know, private equity kind of stuff. So, you know, there's a lot of firms out there that do, you know, sustainable investing, and some of them are quite good. So, but I don't, I'm not, you know, an expert in that area. I can introduce you to some folks who are, if you're actually interested, and you can decide for yourself.
I think also just to quickly add is that it's not because there are currently barriers that restrict certain market activities that the market is not working at all, because as Rod mentioned, there are clearly already companies and kind of funds and all those kinds of things that are already moving in that direction and providing opportunities for investors, and it's a matter of allowing them to expand further and create more opportunities to make it as easy as possible for investors like yourself to be a part of that. But I just think it shows the power of the market to push through even when there's all this opposition to it. But if we can focus on solutions that reduce even more of the barriers, then I think the opportunities will be even more.
But I think it's also important to say that there has to be a capital market that is functioning as a precondition. Dr. Ronheimer.
Thank you very much. Martin Ronheimer from the Austrian Institute. I know you, Chris. You know me, but you don't know it. We will talk afterwards. I would very much contribute to your project. I'm too old. I would even like to convince Pope Francis of your ideas, and I have already tried, I can assure you. And I do something in the Welt am Sonntag this Sunday will appear an article of mine which promotes exactly this idea. But I have another question. You certainly know Andrew McAfee's book, More from Less, and he very much supports these ideas, which are, but with there is one thing he adds, and he thinks that, well, competition, capitalism is absolutely crucial for environmental reasons, but there is also a role of regulation, of good and prudent regulation. We have the example of the catalytic adapter. What is it called? Catalyst. The catalyst of the cars. You know, I think entrepreneurs and capitalists need also the right incentives. They will do it if they have some incentives to do it and to make it cleaner and so on. So, what do you think? What is the role of prudent and very modest regulation in this in speeding up this market process the market process you are precisely? Do you think the market will produce it for itself, or it needs some kind of legal input, of regulatory input, which does not hamper the market, but which would drive it in a certain direction?
Who of you wants to pick up on that question?
So, you know, I recognize, you know, that there is sometimes a need for regulation, and sometimes regulation is a simple way to do things. However, my fundamental point is that if we only do things through regulation, we are going to end up over-regulated. We need to have a variety of policy tools that also expand freedom. So we need to address these problems as much as we can by expanding freedom, because that's the most beneficial thing we can do for our economy and for the prosperity of the world, for lifting people out of poverty, for expanding their opportunities and freedoms. So if you only address problems by taxing people more and limiting their freedom, you're going to end up in a very, very controlled society where freedom becomes a memory of the past, right? Right. Right. Well, no, I'm riffing off of what you're saying and not necessarily addressing your question directly. But but all I'm saying is that, you know, I'm not saying we shouldn't have any regulation at all. I'm just saying that that should be minimized in favor of policies that expand freedom. The first best policy option are those which expand freedom. As much as you can do that way, the better.
Well, thank you very much for closing this panel. I would like to pick up on Rod's suggestion that we, of course, running the Free Market Roadshow and the European Resource Bank meeting, and actually the Free Market Roadshow being the largest libertarian event in the world, we're happy to come on in and help you coordinate and organize this initiative, because it's so important. And it's my generation that was involved in the first climate change debates, and when we were bashed as just being as climate denials, and we said, no, we are not afraid. We just believe in innovation. We think that the Schumpeterian principle will solve, the technology will solve the problem, and we should allow for that. And I'm glad that there is a next generation of young economists who are really eager and who want to protect nature and who want to help. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity. And thanks, Rod, for pulling this off, and I'm looking forward to Glasgow in the next days in order to grow the event and the groups, and trust me, our people here that we work with will do that too.
We're looking forward to you know, taking you with us to Glasgow.
And just two very, very quick things. The first one is, if you want to get a copy of the book, there's a book stand around the corner which has a few copies left, and then also you can download a free PDF online at greenmarketrevolution.eco, so that's free. And the final thing is, at the event that Rod mentioned on Monday in Glasgow, we are also launching an international declaration on market environmentalism with those 4 principles I mentioned. We have individuals from nearly 150 organizations around the world signing on to this, and I think it's a sign of the fact that we're moving in the right direction, and people from around the world are signing on to this, and some of kind of the biggest players in the free market space around the world are really realizing this is an opportunity for us to seize. So definitely check that out as well, which is on the same website, and we'll be launching that on Monday.
Well, thanks a lot. Looking forward to seeing you all join this movement, and I announce lunch now.